Um, Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is our pregnancy and parenting in a criminalized body panel, and I am so lucky to be able to introduce our incredible panelists. We have Professor Robin Powell joining us remotely. She previously served as Stetson Law's Bruce R. Jacob Visiting Assistant Professor of Law before becoming an associate professor at University of Oklahoma College of Law. As a disabled woman, Dr. Powell has dedicated her career to advancing the rights of people with disabilities. Before coming to Stetson Law in 2020, Dr. Powell was a research associate at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University. For nearly 5 years, Dr. Powell served as attorney advisor at the National Council on Disability, an independent federal agency that advises the President and Congress on matters concerning people with disabilities. We are also really lucky to be joined by Stephanie Woodward. She is a passionate disability rights advocate, attorney, and executive director of Disability Empower Her Network, a nonprofit organization and dedicated to empowering girls and women with disabilities to lead boldly and live authentically. With a career spanning over a decade, Stephanie has worked to advance the rights of disabled people at local, state, and national levels, blending her legal experience and her lived experience to create meaningful change. As a disabled woman and proud mother of 6, including 2 foster boys, infant triplets, and her beloved daughter who is stillborn, Stephanie brings both professional and personal perspectives to her work. Her parenting journey includes navigating the complexities of in vitro fertilization, which she advocates to make accessible and inclusive for all. We are also joined by Marissa Dikowski. She's a multiply disabled activist and attorney. She serves as the lead Disabilities Community Project staff attorney at TESDEC DC. I'm so sorry, Marissa, for messing that up. A project she formed as the organization's Gallagher Family Foundation Fellow in 2020. She is also an adjunct professor at the American University of Washington College of Law, where she teaches a seminar on disability rights and volunteer founding executive director of the National Disabled Legal Professionals Association. We are also wonderfully joined by Jessica Roach. She is the founder and CEO of Restoring Our Own Through Transformation, a Black woman-led reproductive justice nonprofit focused on maternal child health and birthing justice in Columbus, Ohio. Roots Perinatal Support Doula Model provides innovative interventions that target the improvement of birthing conditions and outcomes for Black families who've collectively been disproportionately impacted by maternal and infant mortality and morbidity. Roots' philosophy of engagement is laser focused on addressing Black maternal, infant, and family health through a health equality lens. Since 2017, Root has achieved and sustained a 0% Black infant and maternal mortality rate and currently serves as a subject matter expert for White House staff, congressional leaders, state and local governments, Central Ohio hospitals, and various national and local community stakeholders. Root is a kindred partner of the National Black Mamas Matter Alliance. She is also the doula to some of my most beloved people and someone I consider a dear friend. We're going to get started. So this is going to be an open discussion style panel, so I'm just going to be posing questions to the panelists. If you have a question you'd like to ask, we do have a movable mic that we can get right out to you, but we're going to start with some basic questions to get the conversation going. So we're going to start off with one: how do race, disability, and socioeconomic status intersect to exacerbate the criminalization of pregnancy and parenting? And can you share any specific examples from your work, your research, or your personal life, if you are comfortable sharing?
You take it. I'm trying not.
Technology is not my thing. It's just a button though. So you can just give me an example. How do we have the intersection and how is it impacting? I mean, it's everywhere. And it's interesting because I will have to say too, first to like all of the other panelists that have spoken today and been in this conference, I have been moved and motivated in multiple ways. And I will say this very honestly, I typically will be like, I'm listening and I'm also doing work. And today has been so incredibly powerful for me and informative. And I always like to say when like I really don't know shit, and I don't. And I keep that in mind as I continue to move forward. And so I really am deeply appreciative of the learning curve and the opportunity to be able to meet and work with folks. It also has driven a very quick expansion of what I thought the answer was going to be to that question. And so I don't have notes now because none of them work. the intersection is incredible. It is deeply rippling, and it is at a huge disparity that definitely impacts Black families in their reproductive health care and reproductive justice. We come very much from the perspective of Black reproductive justice is about autonomy, so therefore no one should have the right to say who, how, where, when, if, to the extreme, to the 10th degree. There should not be any regulatory over us because we've been utilized as a commodity since we were brought here through the transatlantic slave trade, and they continue to use us in that way. And also in that way, they have the policies that have been created and structures over time, while we have what are supposed to be social systems that are helpful to our population. Those social systems have very strategically been created to be able to assist and help those that are of privileged white communities more so than in Black communities. And you see that across the board when it comes into the intersection of looking at disability justice, because that is exactly what it is. It is not rights, it's disability justice, but then also recognizing what it is that our families do experience issues with disabilities, but because of the misnomers that happen inside of our families and inside of the Black culture, whether it be what we have been enculturated to or how it is that we are viewed, they are not viewed as that. It's almost still that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps when we never really had the boots to begin with. And so we see this very specifically in our families, in particular, when we're talking about access to IVF, when we're talking about autoimmune disorders that have rendered people almost like to the point where they cannot be able to function and do not give or are not given the accommodations that are necessary in order to complete certain job tasks because they're not recognized as such. When we see this, when it comes up with our children, where we have children that we know have very definitive, in particular, birth traumas. That was a story that I just shared, and it takes over 2 years to be able to get any type of approval for BCMH, whereas the counterpart of a white child will be approved within the first application and then be able to have access to certain services that the other child will not have access to because they will try to wipe us away. They will try to put it under the carpet. And so we have this, and then that ultimately leads to what we have with the issues with socioeconomics, because if we don't have access to certain accommodations, and we already are dealing with racism that is inherent within all of the political, socioeconomic, and healthcare strata, we have this additional barrier that says that we're not able to be able to function and care for our families, which again has everything to do with how is it that we are placed as Black families as a commodity versus an actual human.
When talking about this question, I come at this from a lens of being an attorney who has represented lots of different parents with disabilities of all races. And I started that as a baby attorney, and now as a mom with a disability that can compare my experiences to the parents that I've represented. And you can really see how race, disability, and poverty interact in ways that lead to families being surveilled, judged, and oftentimes separated. The systems are not neutral. A parent who's disabled, Black or brown, and low income are far more likely to be viewed with suspicion and face state intervention, even when there's no actual harm to the child. And the first case that came to mind for me when I read this question was I represented a blind mother who had a CPS investigation because she was in the middle of a custody battle. And her white, non-disabled, soon-to-be ex-husband expressed concerns for the child's safety. So this, of course, ended up before a judge, and I, in my sweet, naive baby lawyer mind, thought like, well, this is going to be obvious, like not an issue here. I expected that a judge who's an educated person would have educated questions. But I will never forget when the judge asked me what would happen if, when my client was sleeping, her child climbed into the refrigerator and shut the door and suffocated. And like just like gymnastics, you had to get to that specific hypotheticals here, which even the husband did not bring up as a scenario. And my only thought was to say, Judge, if you were asleep, you know if your child was in the refrigerator. Not have an answer. And I think that really highlighted for me that this is absurd, and this case certainly would not have happened to a sighted person at all, but almost certainly wouldn't have escalated in the same way if she were white or middle class. And that is a tactic now that I have chosen to use with judges when they ask absurd questions. I don't ask, well, how would a non-disabled person do it? I specifically ask, how would you do it, Judge? It makes it personal, and they don't seem to like it very much. But this is also a pattern that I've seen for disabled parents of color being denied the benefit of a doubt, where white parents in similar situations are met with sometimes inappropriate curiosity, but it's still not from a lens of doubt. And as a white woman, I'm really conscious of the privilege that I've held in this situation as a disabled parent. And one of the scenarios that come to mind for me with that is one of the first times I took my foster son to the doctor. In my county, every foster child goes to the same doctor, which really helps with continuity of care should they move from family to family. It is a really good model in theory. And the doctor was talking to me a lot about trauma and different ways to support my foster son. And my husband was there, and then she handed us a bunch of paperwork, and I said, thank you so much. And she said, I don't know if you're going to be able to read that. It might be above your level. And I said, you know what, like, I really appreciate that you want to make sure that information is accessible. It's really important. If at any point your practice wants to like talk with me about how we can make some of these documents plain language, like, I think that would be a really good use of our time. I was really trying not to take it personally. And she said, no, but really, what is your education level? And my husband, who is a much more patient level man than I am, said, you know, if I can't read it with my master's degree, then I really hope that my lawyer wife will be able to interpret it for me. And I can't imagine what experience a foster parent of color with a disability would have had in that same situation. And the doubt that we would be able to read paperwork about trauma so that we could support our foster son. So when thinking about all of this, I just know that doctors questioning my parenting, I know that my whiteness softens those interactions still. And that's not right, and it's not equitable. And we can't talk about parenting and disability without also confronting the ways in these identities overlap and how systemic racism, ableism, and classism lead to that criminalization. And parenting while disabled should not be seen as inherently risky. But in our current systems, that's exactly what it's seen as, and we are questioned all of the time.
I want to see if either of our other panelists that are joining us remotely wanted to jump in. I know it can be hard on Zoom.
Yeah, Robin, do you want to go? I'm happy to go first, but
Either or.
okay. This is Marissa. So I think some of the things that I wanted to make sure I highlighted at the top is the eugenic connection between incarceration and jails and prisons, institutions, guardianship, and involvement of child protective services. Ultimately, the purpose is to push disabled folks out of sight and out of mind. So they would frankly rather that we not exist. And it's also about control over us, our bodies, and our autonomy. Not to mention the fact that sometimes things like involuntary commitment and institutionalization are used as alternatives to incarceration in jails or prisons in the carceral system. So that's just kind of something to frame the conversation. First, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about miscarriage, particularly as we are in these times post Roe, post Dobbs, I should say. I think about cases like Brittany Watts, who experienced a placental abruption, and her doctors described her as on death's door. Had a risk of uncontrolled bleeding, blood clots, infection, multi-organ failure, respiratory arrest, could have lost the ability to have children in the future, chronic pain, permanent disability, death. Um, and yet she was arrested and incarcerated for a miscarriage. Think about the darkest time in your life experiencing incarceration as a result, on top of everything else. I worry about the impact on disabled women, particularly disabled women of color who face greater risks of complication and maternal morbidity, and how these kinds of allowances um, for government control and intervention post-obs will impact them. I also think about forced sterilization. Um, Obviously, we know, Skinner made it unconstitutional to force sterilization on incarcerated folks convicted of some crimes, but we also know that Buck v. Bell, which allowed for the state of Virginia to coercely sterilize Carrie Buck, it was never expressly overturned, and 38 states still have the ability to force sterilization on disabled folks. And we also know that birthing people who experience disabilities like postpartum depression and may harm their children or almost harm their children may be coerced into sterilization as an alternative to incarceration. We also know those who use substances may also be essentially coerced into sterilization using exploitative practices, like providing money or also alternatives to incarceration. I talk about CPS, but I feel like Robin could probably take a lot of that and talk a lot about how disabled parents are just more likely to have CPS called on them, particularly Black disabled parents, poor disabled parents. Um, and stories like Stephanie's case are not uncommon, and race and gender really play a role as well in being viewed as quote unquote dangerous or quote unquote hysterical. So I will kick it over to Robin if she has anything to add.
Sure. So thank you all for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but my tort students, I'm sure, would be very sad if I had to cancel today's class. So, I think just to back up a little, I'm so glad that Marissa brought up Buck v. Bell. And I just want to emphasize sort of one piece of the Buck v. Bell sort of saga that people I don't think pay enough attention to, which is not only was she forcibly sterilized, but Carrie Buck had her daughter removed at birth and placed in the foster family's home, where she had become impregnated because of a sexual assault. And so Carrie Buck never saw her daughter again. And so I point that out because we know, if we look at why Carrie Buck was institutionalized right to begin with, it was because she was poor. And so you can see how sort of classism and ableism really intersect in her case and led to, again, not only the forced sterilization, but also the forcible removal of her child by what now I think is aptly called the family policing system. So I would encourage everyone to stop calling it child protective services or child welfare services, because it's a misnomer. It is neither looking out for the welfare nor the protection of families. And so just to sort of start there, I think there is sort of a lot of evidence that indicates that parents with disabilities, especially parents of color with disabilities and economically disadvantaged parents with disabilities, experience sort of almost the worst of the worst when we're talking about sort of any policing of either pregnancy and or parenthood. And so if you begin at sort of that decision-making time, looking at it through the lens of reproductive justice, which of course is focused on the right to have a child, not to have a child, and to parent one's child safely with dignity, we know that at every stop along that path, parents or people with disabilities rather, are denied that autonomy and that freedom to make those decisions, whether it is to have a child or not to have a child. And then if they choose to have a child, being able to actually raise that child. And so whether it is, racism in the area of trying to become a parent, whether it be just, accessing pregnancy care, or in some instances needing assisted reproductive technologies, sort of we see that racism plays a role. We know that people of color experience huge rates of maternal mortality and morbidity. And of course, people with disabilities also experience huge rates. And we know that recent research indicates that for people with disabilities of color, the rates of maternal morbidity and mortality are even more exacerbated. And so that's when it all starts. And I point that out because if they so are fortunate enough to survive all of that, then those same providers are the ones that often begin sort of that role of being the police. And so we see that people with disabilities are more likely to be referred to the family policing system immediately after giving birth. And I've had parents with disabilities essentially tell me it's like they were there to catch them when it was coming out. Essentially, they knew that they were giving birth. And the family policing system was there. And again, when you bring in the issues around race or color, of course, it is just more exacerbated. And people that are far smarter than me have done a lot of really good work on this area. Particularly, I'm thinking about Dorothy Roberts, who's written extensively on how, when you look at sort of who's involved in the family policing system, it is low-income families of color. It does not look like sort of the, middle or upper class white individuals. It's just not, that's not who it is. And it's also not non-disabled people. It is, again, sort of this intersection. And so we see that the policing begins there. And the problem then just intensifies because people with disabilities, especially people of color and economically disadvantaged parents with disabilities, are just more exposed to mandated reporters. They live with sort of that constant scrutiny. I can't tell you how many disabled parents have been so excited their children turn 18 because they now know they can finally breathe sort of a sigh of relief. They no longer have to worry about that threat, because even if they have not been referred to the family policing system, they know that the chance is highly likely. And we see sort of this web of surveillance that people with disabilities, again, particularly those who are racialized or have economically disadvantaged, they are really sort of in the middle of that web, really. They are sort of at the height of all of these problems. And then the last piece I would mention is when you're involved in the family policing system, what I've seen particularly amongst disabled parents, but particularly those of color, is that they're often considered and deemed sort of non-compliant. And sort of, I think it's worth sort of thinking about what does that even mean? And it is, it's so embedded in sort of racism and classism and ableism, sort of what that term even means. But being sort of quote unquote non-compliant almost assuredly then lends to the child never returning. And sort of how do we unpack sort of what that idea is of non-compliant, because it is very sort of based on this non-disabled approach, this, very white, again, having money, sort of all of these pieces come into what we determine to be compliant or not. And so what I would end with all of that to say is something that I think also needs to be recognized. This isn't just about the person with a disability. It's about the family as a whole, the family unit. And I think far too often we try to say, we have to put children's rights and parents' rights into different categories. And I think that that is problematic because we know that children almost always do better when they are raised by their biological natural parents in their homes. And so we need to start addressing this sort of through a family rights lens.
Thank you so much, Robin. That actually sets us up really wonderfully for my next question, which you referenced a little bit, and that's talking about how the overlap of social, and I'm going to use air quotes, support systems, such as the Board of Developmental Disabilities, the Family Policing System, Medicaid, the probate court, and how those all overlap and the policing impact of seeking the provision of care within marginalized communities.
All right, so I'll jump in. All right, so the overlap of all of these systems really creates this tangled web that disabled parents have to navigate just to survive. And really not given the opportunity to thrive when you have to navigate all of this. And when they're described as support systems that act more like surveillance systems, it doesn't feel like support because it's not. So in cases that I work with, just imagine being a disabled parent who has Medicaid. You need a piece of adaptive equipment in order to safely parent. You ask for that help, and Medicaid then denies it because it's not considered medically necessary. And then CPS is called because your doctor then thinks that you're endangering your child in not meeting your child's needs. Or imagine relying on an attendant. Your attendant is late. So you are unable to get out of bed to get ready. So now your child is late to school because you had to wait until you could get out of bed to get ready. Now your child get ready. And then the school calls to report your parenting and an investigation has started. These are not hypothetical scenarios. These are the real cases that I've worked on, and they show how interconnected and punitive these systems can be. And for disabled parents in marginalized communities, especially Black and Brown disabled parents, this overlap becomes a trap. Asking for help opens the door for scrutiny, and it shouldn't be this way, but systems should work together to support families and not punish them for asking for that help. And one of the best examples I can think of is I represented a Black deaf man. He had a child that he had to bring to the hospital who ended up inpatient. By the time he finally got access to an interpreter, he disagreed with the medical care of his child. And simply by disagreeing with the care provided by the doctors, the hospital called for intervention. There was no allegations of neglect, abuse, anything, but then they were trying to allege medical neglect because he did not want certain procedures that were more invasive than what he felt was necessary in order to assist his daughter. Naturally, after he found out that a child protective worker was there to interview him, he got upset. And he uses ASL to communicate. ASL is a wonderful language, and part of your communication is expressive. He was described as, by the hospital staff and the CPS worker, as aggressive because of the way he was signing, because he was upset that there was call for intervention for him medically neglecting his child when disagreeing with the doctors. The child was removed from his care. And even though there was no allegations of abuse whatsoever, no indication of abuse, it was that he communicated aggressively. Ultimately, he was reunited with his child, but I think that really illustrates how these systems of support are really systems of surveillance and trapping.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
It's okay, sorry.
So I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, and I really did not want to be a policy person, but I got pushed into it because of the work that I do. I'm a nurse, I'm a midwife, I'm a public health professional. And mostly I'm a Black mother, right? And I'm probably gonna get into a lot of trouble for this. God, I wish I could have just stuck with the notes. It's okay. It's no problem. And so when we're talking about, so for the air quote, the social systems, one of the things that I do is talk about the historical connotations of how it is that we're impacted. It's also considered the principle of Sankofa within certain facets of our culture because we are non-monolithic, but in certain facets of our culture. We look at what has happened, you have to look at what has happened before in order to do it in your present and move forward. And with that, it is very clear that whatever we're talking about, in particular, when we're talking about the context of the United States, because the United States is a very different system when it comes to the intersection of the transatlantic slave trade and how chattel slavery manifested itself here versus throughout the rest of the diaspora. You see that actually manifested. There's a reason that I'm saying all of this. The social systems that are in play, I come from the school of thought and have been raised around, luckily, and have had a lot of integrative study into this, is to understand that those social systems of support that impede most of us throughout our lives was absolutely not created with anything for the Black person or the Black body in mind at all. And so I am very clear, and we are very clear with our organization, that in order to be able to provide what are quote unquote social supports, we do that very internally. What does that mean? We obviously have what are loose laws around mandated reporting. We don't utilize those systems, I mean, literally taking it to the line, right? Like just making sure that there is not that level of intervention. We create and have created and are continuing to expand a system of healthcare and supports within our organization so that we don't have to worry about whether or not we have to bill Medicaid for something, or if we have to worry about, we don't utilize family policing whatsoever, right? We have our own internal peer-to-peer groups that are able to provide support for our families. We have our own practitioners that we contract with and have to work with us under our guidelines, or you will be immediately terminated. We are very clear about what confidentiality looks like, and confidentiality expands well beyond HIPAA regulations. We are very, very clear about the fact that there is nobody that's going to walk into a birthing room without one of us there, and you will not be able to ask someone for what is considered informed consent when they're in the middle of labor, because technically they cannot make that decision for themselves, so that they have someone else that is there as an advocate, and here's the paperwork to say such, right? And this crosses over into even with the perspective of the personal experience, right? Like I have a child that has a disability, and I have a grandson that does as well. I'm about to have my third grandchild. So, and during her labor, which was during COVID, and those restrictions that they were utilizing for that, it took everything, including multiple phone calls, to be able to get into the hospital. And once I was there, the only thing that they were considering was, are you planning on, should we go ahead and put in your IUD when we go and get the baby? Now, my daughter presented to the hospital with severe and sudden onset preeclampsia. As I'm watching her vital signs change, she's a young disabled woman. The only way to address what it is that we need for us inside of our community is to address it internally for ourselves. And that gets back to the point of allyship. Allyship doesn't work, and you're getting in the way. You have to be the accomplice, the advocate, and put yourself as the body in front of in order to make sure that you provide those protections. Because the moment that you have to interact with any of these systems as a Black person, as a Black disabled person, as a disabled person of color, as a disabled person that is an immigrant or a new American that doesn't speak English, and any of those categories across the board, you will be immediately criminalized beyond what you were already criminalized as getting on the floor as a Black or person of color. And so we strive to work very diligently to make sure that we can cover those quote unquote systems of support so that we can create what is basically the Black Panther philosophy, and make sure that we are caring for ourselves and making sure that we are providing for our clients and our families for what they need so that they do not have to be exposed to the system that is in play at all.
This is Marissa. Thank you for that. I think one of the biggest challenges is the legal system itself. It was not designed by us. It was not designed for us. It was not designed with us in mind. and it is largely used as a tool of oppression. So I'm really glad that we're hearing from so many non-lawyers today, because this is so important and we have to be driven by the community in everything we do. And so thank you all. But obviously this is about more than just the legal system, right? Like social workers routinely perpetuate ableism, racism, classism, eugenics, paternalism. I think one example is a case called Sheehan, where a social worker called the police on an individual in a group home who was struggling with her mental health. Um, and that eventually led to her getting shot. Frankly, this is something that happens a lot. Police involvement in mental health crises, where that is not that is not the appropriate person to become involved, right? We need, um, you know, um, we need MCOTs and other like um, other types of interventions that are more appropriate for disabled folks. But I think when we're talking about policing, this also happens with disabled parents and disabled families. Um, Perfect parents don't exist, but we have to be. And we talked about this on an earlier panel, but non-disabled people are not allowed to make mistakes or bad decisions. We're not. And disabled women of color in particular are not. Everything is under this microscope. And to state the obvious, the more involved the state is in your life, the more monitoring there's gonna be. And disabled folks may need to have direct support workers, for example, in their homes, which can feel invasive but necessary to have the opportunity to live and work in your community or have the independence that you want. But with that can come all of this criminalization. And there may be assumptions about that and your need for that direct support by the family policing system and other systems. And the fewer resources you have, the more likely you are to rely on supports like SSI, etc. And we think about TANF and SNAP, which are particularly problematic when it comes to monitoring. There are a lot of additional requirements, like work requirements, and there's a lot of judgment placed on recipients who are often parents. Um, these happen to be some of the most stigmatized benefits, what we usually describe as welfare. And TANF often pursues money from biological parents who might not be in the picture and takes from child support. And there's a lot of judgment in that about single parents, many of whom are single moms who are also disabled women of color. And that's kind of how criminalization comes into their lives, is through receipt of these types of benefits. Um, think and guardianship, I'll say a little bit about that too, but that process can also be incredibly invasive. There is a lot of judgment placed on an individual, their decisions, their mistakes, and judges don't always understand, but are left to make determinations about our very autonomy. Um, and when disabled parents are placed under guardianship, that is that you're gonna see that when you see disabled parents put under guardianship, or when there are termination of parental right proceedings. That microscope that you see, where you'll see a simple mistake turn into the thing that removes children from your home.
If I can just jump in, I think, this is Robin. So the irony that I have found in all of this is, if you look at cases involving non-disabled parents that are involved in the family policing system as sort of a whole, you see that they are often faulted for not having support systems, for sort of, not having that wide network in their lives, sort of people to help with them, because it takes a village, that idea. Now, flip it around, and if there's a disabled parent involved and they do have wide support networks, and they are using that village approach, which of course is what it takes to raise a child, then that's used against them. And so there is sort of this complete reversal. And so when we see a parent with a disability who does rely on supports to help raise their child. And let me put it out there, everyone relies on supports, even if it's things like ordering Uber Eats or Instacart. I mean, every person relies on supports, every parent. And so, but when you're a disabled parent and you are using supports, it's seen as C, you can't do it on your own. C, you are not capable. C, you can't even take care of yourself. How could you possibly take care of someone else? And so the whole sort of ethos around support for parents with disabilities becomes so complicated. And we have so many scenarios where even when supports would be hugely beneficial, and parents with disabilities will tell you that, they don't want to go ask for it because they know that that asking of help will inevitably lead to the questioning of their parenting capabilities and often then the removal of their children. And there's so many reasons for this, but I go back to sort of the thing I mentioned earlier, which was the mandatory reporting laws, and sort of where they come into play. And I am hugely critical of those laws. So let me start by saying that, and I say that as a former social worker. In another life, I was a social worker before I became a lawyer. And so, in fact, I had to give up my social work license because I could no longer be a mandated reporter because I'm a lawyer, sort of all of that. But all of that to say, what happens is often those same people that are supposed to be supporting the families are then the ones that are reporting the families. And I have to say that it's not always done out of bad intentions. And I say that because I've often asked people who have referred, why did you refer that family? Especially healthcare providers, why do you feel you have to refer the families? And their answer inevitably is often, well, I thought they could use some help. And so I thought that the family policing system could be a support. And I always say, well, you would think so if you looked at sort of the definition of the system, but I can assure you that they are not a system that actually does support families. And so we have to sort of really, I think, educate sort of folks on sort of what the system does and doesn't do. Because really so often, I mean, absolutely, there's huge surveillance scrutiny. I'm not dismissing that, but I also think that there's nowhere to turn, and that becomes problematic. And then, since I'm dissing all kinds of people, I will also say that I don't even think disability supports does a great job supporting people in their parenting capacities. I've done a lot of work over the years on this issue, and I remember writing the original Rocking the Cradle report, and I was trying to get sort of data on how many parents with disabilities existed. Because the data is awful on it. And we found that even disability providers, including Centers for Independent Living, don't ask those that they're supporting if they are parents, if they want to be parents. They never sort of dive into that because our whole motto around independent living has been, this person's got an apartment, maybe they're in school, maybe their job, check mark, they're done, they're independently living. And so we don't go into that conversation. We don't see sort of, and I think, that's a problem also. So I think disability services are also not supporting parents, and having sort of these separate supports also is problematic. So I think, there is this issue where even if someone could benefit from that support, I almost always have to tell them don't do it, which feels really awful. It really feels terrible. And I think that's why we heard earlier, I think the importance of things like mutual aid would be so beneficial in these scenarios. Something I think that we really need to sort of have more supports that are led by and for parents with disabilities. And I think that that is ultimately sort of one of the solutions, in addition to just abolishing the family policing system entirely, which I strongly believe we need to do. But we need to sort of be creating those community-based services. And by community-based, I mean from parents with disabilities for parents with disabilities.
This is Marissa. Just to hype up Robin a little bit real quick. So Rocking the Cradle is still such an incredible resource. But it was what, 2012? It's 2025 and a lot of it is still relevant. So just pointing that out.
Yes, it is remarkably relevant. I'm currently working on sort of an update to it, and I can tell you there's not much to update. That is sort of the unfortunate. So came out on September 27, 2012. That's my baby. I always say that's when I gave birth. And it is very much the same today, insofar as even 42 states and the District of Columbia continue to include disability as grounds for termination of parental rights. So we have not made much progress at all.
I was also gonna jump in and hype up Rock in the Cradle because when I was in practice as a P&A attorney, and I had a lot of questions from disabled parents about access and supports, that was one of the only resources that existed that I was able to send them that gave them any sort of support. And my organization was not interested in creating more resources or investing in it. And so as much as I was frustrated that like that was all I could do, it was so nice to have something that was tangible that I could actually hand to my clients and give them something. And then I also wanted to touch on, Robin was talking about some of the ironies of the system, and one of the things that I always think about is the irony that these systems are more than happy to share information when it's around surveillance and criminalization. But if you have ever tried to work within these systems and tried to get on Medicaid and tried to get your DD waiver, you know that you are constantly being denied because you weren't told something the first time, and they don't know what's going on with Medicaid or whoever, and blah, 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 blah. But whenever it's about a report or there's a threat, all of a sudden now they can all communicate and talk to each other. And so that was one other thing that I just wanted to rise up and talk about. And the other thing I've seen in some of my practice has been when hospitals disagree with the care, particularly that is being wanted from families of color, specifically Black families, they will move for guardianship over the patient who is currently in their care in order to remove the families from the conversation. And then that also creates a guardianship that now this family has a court constantly overseeing all of their family decisions that they're making. And so that raises the level of the heightens of risk of criminalization, whether it's from the family policing services or adult policing services. Those things all put these families at higher risk of this oversight. And I think we have a question in the back, is that right?
Hi, it's Shakir. Thank you so much for your remarks thus far. I'd like to present the issue of giving birth in shackles and anyone's thoughts on that. It's sad to say that when I was an intern, so this is probably what, 2017 or something like that, for AAPD, I was going to a presentation on giving birth in shackles, and especially how that is the effectuation of control on the Black female body. And the First Step Act, it's 2025, still has only passed the House. I know, I'm very well aware that many states have passed legislation banning giving birth in shackles, and yet it still occurs. And when you add on that the layer of being a Black person capable of giving birth with a disability and you're incarcerated, especially since we have individuals here who aid with that process, I would love to hear your perspective on that horribly egregious practice.
I'm gonna sit back. Marissa or Robin, do you guys want to comment?
Yeah. This is Marissa. So I think Robin talked a little bit about this earlier, but the maternal morbidity rate for disabled women is about 11 times that of non-disabled women, and for Black women, I think it's about 2 to 3 times. Now take Black disabled women, and I'm sure you can do the math. I don't think we have that data at the moment related to that intersection, but we can make assumptions based on the data that we do have. We also know that incarcerated folks are disproportionately disabled, and that includes women. I will also say that in this moment with attacks on trans folks, you now have an additional layer of denied health care and safety for birthing people in prisons. But yeah, I mean, it's maternal mortality, maternal morbidity that is higher in disabled folks. And so when you are incarcerated, access to healthcare and access to um access to adequate supports as a pregnant person is severely limited. Um, and folks are often denied basic treatment, basic care, basic prenatal support. Um, that I mean, it's like it's a human rights violation, right? So it's I mean, I personally don't think folks who are pregnant should be incarcerated. Personally, I don't think anybody should be incarcerated, but I'm also an abolitionist, so um I think this definitely presents a particularly problematic concern for disabled folks for many of those reasons.
So I'm obviously against shackling of any type whatsoever, ever, especially in the birthing space. I think that it is an unnecessary restriction and confinement, especially if you speak about it even just from a logical perspective of where are you going to go? I'm in the middle of labor. What really? Like I'm not going anywhere fast. Okay. And also because of the type of crimes that we typically are incarcerated with as Black women, where Black women are now the highest rising number of incarcerated persons in the United States. And the reasons that we are being incarcerated are so often for non-violent crimes. So if you're going to, I'm only speaking about this from a logical, like whatever logical perspective that folks want to potentially use, because there are times where we are incarcerated for what are considered quote unquote violent crimes, but it also has very much to do with the intersection of violence and domestic violence and IPV in our own home. And so then we're being criminalized for that when it's actually self-defense. So, full story. I don't believe in shackling. We have been strong advocates in the state of Ohio in regards to changing the codes that are involved in our criminal systems. It is a huge challenge. And the way that it is written is currently very subjective because it has wording in it such as unless the person poses potential injury to self or others, which can leave it in very, very wide open. The other part of that is knowing that the further we got in the involvement of the incarceration system, and advocating for non-shackling during the birthing process, we started getting closed out even more because we were making some headway, and then there were other factors that came into play with the system that started making it so that we couldn't be there because not only were we seeing that it was shackling that was an issue, but inadequate nutrition, access to appropriate prenatal care, not forcing sterilization, but definitely lots of coercion in regards to opportunities for parole and it being considered good behavior if you were willing to do so. Huge, I am an advocate absolutely across the board that no pregnant person and no pregnant person should ever be shackled during that period of time. And they should not be shackled during the immediate follow-up in their postpartum care. I think it is incredibly restrictive, especially when you're talking about the physiological processes that happen immediately and can lead to some of these morbidity and mortality issues that we are discussing. In regards to the statistics, I wanted to actually address two of those things. One, there is no disaggregate data currently in the public health system. We do not measure it, which is part of what started frustrating me earlier today. What that intersection is with Black and disabled and the maternal mortality rate, there is none currently. And then to the second point, the Black maternal mortality rate is actually 4 times that of its white counterpart. Now, Black maternal mortality was the only maternal mortality statistic that increased in the last statistics. Everyone else's and every other category decreased. So there clearly is a significant issue when it comes to the intersection of race and care. And I am quite sure if we were to do that data, we would see a phenomenal jump when you're talking about the disaggregate between what those are that are Black disabled persons and those that are white disabled persons, and what that health disparity gap would be in regards to the mortality rate. I'll add this one thing. The reason why that conversation is always so challenging for me, because it's one of the ones that we obviously go to, right? It is the narrative about us in the United States. But the reality is, like we talked about before, and this is no joke, we've served almost 1,000 families, right? I've served myself in the last 25 years, close to 2,000. Whether it be through direct service, as their midwife, as their nurse, as their consult, as their advocate, whatever the case may be, we're still talking zero. Zero. It has to come into play as to why it is that we, as a little tiny community-based organization, are able to say that we have never lost a Black mother, ever. But we have an entire country that keeps letting us die.
Can I just jump in real quickly? And I'm just pointing out, there is a few recent studies that actually look at sort of the at least morbidity. I'm not sure about mortality, but I'm thinking of specifically looking at Black and brown women with intellectual disabilities. And they're actually, so there is some new research in the last like 2 years, I would say, that does show sort of what we would expect. And I know that there are currently researchers, also disabled women of color, that are doing some ongoing research on this area. So I just want to point it out, because I think that that will be instructive of sort of where this all goes wrong. And I mean, I think, we do need to recognize, because it is something, I mean, I would say the same for disabled parents. We just don't know enough about that intersection. We have to do so much extrapolating that there is this huge need for this research. So I only know about studies with respect to parents with intellectual disabilities that looks at that intersection, but it's bad. It's all bad. It's all bad outcomes. And I don't know if they do mortality, but I know they do morbidity.
I think to add to that, like there's no disagreement with that as far as what we're talking about in regards to research studies, but those are research studies. Those are not like overall statistical analysis, which needs to happen because even for the general public that may not necessarily read, statistics, we have a better, and I'm saying we as part of the general public, right? I have a better chance of being able to have access to that information if it's that larger scale national statistic versus what can potentially be academic research, which very few will have access to. And so I think that, to your point, yes, maybe that is starting to set the stage to be able to have that, maybe not under this administration and this public health atmosphere, but to set the stage to be able to say, like, we need to have this data, and we need to have this data disaggregated in such a way so that we can be able to see those distinctions. But the overall was that the research studies are definitely not reaching the public. They're more than likely not even reaching practitioners, because they barely read ACOG updates, let alone an academic paper. And definitely the general public can't have access to that, because we don't know that it's always there, right?
Yeah.
Unless we're inside of that microcosm in that way.
Right. And it's only going to sort of, that lack of knowledge, I guess you could say, is only going to get worse, because now they have taken down all of the potential data sets. They just got rid of the PRAMS data, which is the main data set you use to look at pregnancy outcomes. And they fired, I think, all the PRAMS researchers right now at HHS. That's a whole issue. So yeah, so it's only sort of, it's this issue where it's only, in many ways, that lack of knowledge is only going to intensify, which becomes its own sort of problem. So it almost feels like sort of demonstrative of why it's sort of on us, because no one else is coming for us, it feels like, in many ways. And so I think that points to sort of the importance of groups like yourself that sort of have that zero rate, and sort of how do we replicate that, because that is sort of, we have a problem in the United States, a big problem, and it's not a problem that doesn't have a solution. It just, we need to have that will to have the solution.
Well, thank you all so much. So I think my next question is, so what are some ways that providers, support workers can push back on surveillance and criminalization of pregnancy and parenting?
Well, I know that one of the things that we do, right, is that we get started really early. The basis of the organization and the foundation is that we don't believe in empowerment. It's actually a re-empowerment. Because we know that we already innately come with the knowledge that we need, we just may not have the language to articulate it in that setting, and I'm a real big fan of like language. And interpreting of language and being able to, provide that opportunity for our clients and our families to be able to be like, oh, so this meant this, right? And so, it's important for us, one, to get started. We do family planning, we do abortion services, we do, support with reproductive assistance, IVF, the whole 9 yards. We do holistic care when it comes to that as well. And we do a great deal of work with really being deeply engaged with our families. And I mean, members, all members of our families, whether it be that it's parents that are partnered, or if grandma is a huge part of that, or if it's like your bestie, and you know what I mean? I mean, you know exactly what I mean. Like, I'll make phone calls and be like, I can't say this exactly, but I need you to make this phone call. And so we do a lot of work with our, so that when our parents step into the room, or when a family member steps into the room and advocates, they actually have like very clear, distinct, almost cheat sheets, right? Because this is something that we consistently talk about all the time. And we make sure that like, no, this is actually what, don't let anybody tell you that this is the policy, because it isn't actually a policy. And before someone tells you that it's a policy, or if they do and you don't happen to know specifically, ask them to show it to you in writing. And if they can't show it to you in writing, you make sure that you call one of us if we're not already there. And so it's really important. I always tell my perinatal support specialist, like, the ultimate goal is that you know you've done your job when you're no longer needed in the room. And so, you know, also, if we were to say what would be like the greatest success of our organization, is that I would be like, one day, we don't need to be here anymore. And we won't have to find another job. Until that point, it is really important. Like, we don't believe in, a lot of people are talking a lot about doula services, and it's become kind of a pop culture thing, and whatever the case may be. It's not about the birth. Because most of us can just biologically handle the birth itself, right? Like, we know that there are things that we need. We know that there are things that we need for our bodies. We know our individual selves and our health constraints, our disabilities, our non-disabilities, our wishes, all of those things, right? But we need to be able to have the advocacy and the knowledge to be able to say, oh, no, I actually can do this. Or you didn't offer this to me, and so now I'm asking for the receipt of that type of care. And I think that it's necessary for all of us as people that work inside of what is social justice across the board, to remember that if we step into the situation and believe that we are there to be the ones that are the advocates for someone else, and that we are the ones that are going to basically show the way, we are ultimately taking autonomy away from the agency of the people that we are caring for, and then we're ultimately just operating in the same way that all primarily white institutions operate.
If I can add to that, so when we're talking about providers and support workers, I just, in the context of disability and parenting, I don't see them coming from a support mindset. So we have the support workers, but it's not a supportive mindset. It's often a protective or preventative mindset. And I was telling some last night my experience as a 28-week pregnant woman with triplets, going to a hospital that I was unfamiliar with, because it was not the hospital I planned to give birth at, but my kids had different plans, and we had to go to a different hospital that could meet the NICU needs of 28-weekers, which I just don't recommend in general. But when I got there, the doctors are clearly not familiar with me. I'm not their patient. They see that I'm a wheelchair user. They see that my husband's a wheelchair user. I am about to have an emergency C-section. We arrived at 6:30. My babies were in the world by 7:10. So like, that was a very fast emergency C-section. And we spent 6 minutes of the time period before I went into surgery arguing about the fact that I would not sign consent for an IUD to be placed in me. That is not, I don't know how that was supportive of me, it was supportive of my children. One of them literally had his arm coming out of my cervix. I was already an incredibly high-risk pregnancy with triplets at 28 weeks. And the harm that can be caused in 6 minutes of arguing over an IUD, afterwards, going in to see my children in the NICU and hearing a nurse say that she is deeply concerned about this situation with the two wheelchair user parents. That is not a support worker in that point. That is certainly a person who is trying to prevent our parenting. And I, of course, invited her to express her concerns to anyone they wanted, because I personally was in the mindset I wanted to see her face when she found out I was a foster mom, and any system she was going to call was already going to say that I've got the thumbs up to parent. So I really think that providers and support workers have to actively challenge their internalized belief that disability somehow equals danger or incompetence. And that really starts with listening to disabled parents and believing them when they say what they need or don't need. If that nurse had asked me for 1 second, anything, I think that she would have found out I don't need her opinion about whether or not I can raise my children. But she also would have found out that I already have children that are being competently taken care of. But when you're in a position of power, whether it's a social worker, nurse, doctor, advocate, asking, am I helping keep this parent keep their family together, or am I going to cause criminalization and tear them apart? And this could mean refusing to report disabled parents who ask for help, because the moment we ask for help, we are reported as not being able to do our jobs as parents. And instead, actually work with us to access the real support. And when I like Robin, I'm very much in agreement with her ideology that it should be a community support system of disabled parents helping other disabled parents. And it might be testifying in court about a parent's ability and capacity to parent. It could mean educating your colleagues about the difference between risk and bias. And specifically, when you're doing this education, can it not just come from disabled people? As a disabled lawyer and parent, I understand that I have now taken on as my profession to provide this as a training to medical professionals. But I think we all understand that some people hear it better from someone who looks like them. I can say it all day long, but if someone who they associate identities with strongly says it, somehow the message comes through clearer. I think that providers and support workers can use their roles to affirm disabled people that we are excellent parents, and that needing help isn't a reason to lose your kids, because all parents need help.
Absolutely.
Marissa or Robin, did either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is Marissa. I think so. I agree with a lot of what Stephanie said. It's hard to push back on something that you're a part of. Like the saying, like you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. We just need a new system, and a lot of that push will likely have to come from the outside. That said, it is still helpful to have folks who work within systems. There's a purpose for everyone, just like it's still helpful to have abolitionist lawyers. Um, but I agree, what will make a huge difference is representation. When we have disabled folks in these roles, taking the charge, I think that will make a huge difference, just like having disabled lawyers in the profession will hopefully make a really big difference. Agree about listening to and centering disabled parents and birthing people. That's going to be really critical. And I think, to state the obvious, instead of reporting disabled parents and involving police and courts and family policing, provide the supports, right? Like provide supports, like give people what they're asking for. Educate yourselves and adopt an understanding of supported decision making, and what capacity is. Understanding that we all need help, and that capacity is fluid, and it's presuming capacity is where we always want to start from. And instead of placing blame and judgment, thinking creatively about how to make parenting work for the individual you're working with. And if you have to put together external reports, again, maybe stating the obvious, but highlighting the positives instead of the negatives.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of add to what Marissa said, because she sort of said part of what I was going to say. But I think that we need to sort of flip the script entirely, because right now we approach parenting amongst people with disabilities is sort of this assumption that they're not competent, right? Like that's sort of how the system has approached parents with disabilities. And so we need to sort of flip that completely. We should assume parents with disabilities are in fact competent, that they are capable. And then if they ask for help, then we provide the help. And I say that because so often we're either assuming they're incompetent or assuming they need help, and not at all asking them. And, you know, I worked with a parent with an intellectual disability a few years ago, and one of the things she said to me was, I didn't just wake up one day and have a baby. I've known I was having a baby for the last 9 months. I have a plan. You know, again, I didn't just wake up and think, oh, I think I'll have a baby today. And so I thought that was so true. And then the last thing I would say is actually talk to parents with disabilities. I often joke that I feel like when family policing system workers call me, which they call me all the time, and they'll think they're doing something great. And for example, I got a call several years ago from a system that would definitely not call me now. But they said to me, hi, I have a new mom. She just gave birth. She's in the hospital. She's paralyzed on her left side. What do we need to do for her? I said, well, I'm glad you're thinking about that. I also have no idea who this person is. I wouldn't know them if I walked by them on the street. And they said, well, what should we be providing her? And I said, first of all, you need to ask her if she needs anything. And second of all, you need to ask her if she does what she needs. And they're like, well, can't you just tell me? And I can't tell you how often I get sort of yelled at almost because I don't have an answer when people say, well, what accommodation should we be providing? I have no idea because every person is different. If you've met one disabled parent, you've met one disabled parent. And so it's not sort of what people really do not like that answer, by the way. You think law students don't like it? Depends. I assure you, lawyers and social workers like it even less. But it really does depend. And so again, people with disabilities, we've been living this life. We know what works, we know what doesn't work. You know, our homes are set up in a way that's accessible to us. We have this. And so instead of trying to sort of be a savior, why don't you engage with us? And again, it's so frustrating because on the one hand, I want to celebrate that at least they're thinking about this. But on the other hand, I'm like, I have no idea who the person is. I couldn't answer if I tried. And so going to the actual person, we are the experts on our lives. And I think that having that mentality would change things a lot if people recognize that.
I will also just jump in and say, in terms of accessibility for anything, it doesn't matter if it's pregnancy and parenting, it doesn't matter if it's this conference or class or a bakery, you have to ask the person with the disability. I'm sure all the panelists can tell you, we were hounding them because the only way I can know what you need to be able to access the space that I'm bringing you to is to ask you, because you're the one who knows what your needs are and where you need support or where you don't need support. It's not my job. I can't predict that. Even, you know, I've been working in disability for years. I don't know all of it. As Robin said, you have to talk to the person. I think do we have another question, Katie?
Hi, I have a question adjacent to the surveillance state and mandatory reporting. And I'm asking this question as, so I'm an abortion care worker. I was a counselor, and I was a counselor at an abortion clinic that was treating majority Black patient population. As a non-Black or white person working within these systems, how can we locate together with our clients these risks of the surveillance states? Like, you know, replacing white saviorism with like information and autonomy. I have had issues with mandatory reporting where I'm like, oh no, if only I could have like been like, please don't say something like this beforehand. Like, what are some tangible ways that we can start reckoning with our clients about the surveillance state and give them informational and language tools to use against it or to not endanger themselves?
I'm actually a huge fan of disclaimer.
Okay.
I'm a huge fan of disclaimer. And I mean, like, literally, as you walk in the door, before we get started with your intake, I need you to be aware that, you know, this is either a site that has those that are mandated reporters within, or this is a site that has to do mandated reporting, and here are the things that could potentially be part of your mandated report. And then hand it over and let folks read it and kind of understand it. Ask questions about it because they haven't signed anything yet. So you're technically not treating them. So they get an opportunity to have that discussion and if they have any questions about what it means before they do start answering questions. Now, here's where that comes into play where it can be somewhat challenging. As a healthcare provider, I really need to know all the things, right? Like I really need to know all the things. And as a healthcare provider that has been a mandated reporter for almost 30 years, with the exception of 8 that I gave up my license on purpose so that I would not have to be a mandated reporter while I was doing home births actively. I am also really clear about the difference between, as an example, the use of THC and the safety risk with the use of THC. Those are two very different things. So it doesn't mean that you're calling somebody because they admitted that they smoked a joint a couple of weeks ago, right? It does mean that if they look like they're clearly intoxicated, or if they're impaired, that there may be a safety risk that's associated with that. So it's about the interpretation, unfortunately, because mandated reporting and the things that they say that you're supposed to report for are also somewhat subjective. Even though they look like they're a list, they're written in such a way that they're somewhat subjective. And so some folks are really extreme about it and other folks are kind of like, maybe that's not it. But the disclaimer is really important. And the disclaimer prior to anyone like actually signing that they're going to receive care can be a way of advocating, because then they have the choice to be like, okay, thanks, I gotta go. And you don't know anything. You can't report just, you can, I know plenty of people that do, but you can't just report based on suspicion for real. So that's one of the things that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It reminds me of when I worked at Legal Aid and we had a social worker on staff and we had to think very decided whether the social worker was going to work with that family, because that social worker, of course, would be a mandatory reporter. And so going through that in your head, but also having those conversations as a lawyer with your client, I was able to sort of walk through like, this is what sort of not what you should say or shouldn't say, but just sort of recognize sort of this is the scope within what will happen. And I think that that is absolutely true. But I think a broader thing is, again, I strongly believe in abolishing the family policing system, but one part of that is also abolishing mandatory reporting laws. And I think that maybe it seems like sort of far-fetched, but there are some states that have started to sort of do some work on it. And I would never in a million years think I was about to say what I'm about to say. But Texas has actually done some interesting work on parents' rights, and they have not done it for the reasons we would hope. But the upside of it is it has actually added a lot of protections for families. And I say that because New York has also been trying to pass almost the identical law, and they have not been successful. And again, it's how they got there. Again, I'm not claiming that Texas intended to do this, but they have changed some of their laws around sort of family policing, and sort of the scope of mandatory reporting in ways that are particularly interesting. And so we could do that. We could make the laws more protective. We could really work to change this if we wanted to. Whether we want to as a society is an entirely different problem.
This is Marissa. I think the other thing when we're talking about preparing, clients for the surveillance state, I feel like we also need to give them a bit more credit. So I mean, I would be silly not to think that so many of my like Black clients don't trust the police already or don't trust the system. Like, and they don't trust me when they meet me, and I don't blame them, frankly. Um, I think so. I think starting with that understanding that like they have experience with systems and know that these systems are not there for them, and are dangerous, is helpful to kind of start out with. Obviously, not everybody can possibly know everything about every system or what to say or what not to say. Um, but I think a lot of the information that I come with you today is because I've listened to, I obviously I have my personal experience as a white disabled woman, but I've also listened to other disabled women's experiences, Black disabled folks' experiences, and I think centering and educating yourself in a way um, that also doesn't put a burden on folks sharing their lived experiences. Like, we are here today. We are volunteering to share this, right? Like, that's a good opportunity to learn. Like, reading, like, good opportunity to learn. And so, continuing to do that is going to be really critical.
Actually, because you're absolutely right, like, absolutely right, like, obviously, as a Black woman in the United States, I'm like, I know there's stuff that I'm not talking about, right? The uniqueness of the issue and the reason for like some of the disclaimer is because we're an all Black organization, so there has a tendency to be like, I can be like completely free and open because I'm with my people, and I'm like, wait a minute, you can, and I'm still technically a mandatory reporter. And so that's where, like, for us, the little, where we have seen that there has been any type of concern or issue has been that we're in a space with us and we feel like we can just be totally open about it and everything's gonna be okay and there isn't gonna be that level of judgment. But unfortunately, some of us still have that legal obligation. And so it's a tightrope. But to your point, you're absolutely right. And then there's this like other part now that I've experienced, which is the first time I've actually experienced, because up until I founded Root, I worked in primarily white institutions. So they're just like, we're always wary of the institutions, period, right? But now it's like, oh, I'm walking in, everybody's us. So it does create a unique difference.
I just want to add, I can't come from this from a medical perspective whatsoever. It's never something I wanted to work in, nor have I. As someone who teaches person-centered planning for direct support workers, which is how not to be an asshole if you want to work with disabled people. I think that we need to take some of the onus off of the individual who is receiving the service and support and put some of it on those who are in these mandatory reporting scenarios. If you know you're about to hear something, you're gonna have to report, nothing is stopping you from going to get a coffee.
Absolutely.
Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely.
Like, and we need to take some of the onus off of the individual and take some responsibility. And so this is something I had to teach a lot of my students. Like, if you, as a person, like to imbibe in your marijuana, but you know you have to report it if your client receiving federal funds for their attendance service uses it. You ever have to pee? Because if you the position you are forced to report, then do you really think that they need to report for something that you probably do regularly and they should? So I think that we need to do better at looking at our own systems, and the people who are in these positions of power need to know when to use it and when to take a break.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally agree. It's also why we don't accept federal funds.
And I think Jessica has also mentioned it's bifurcating some conversations in some situations where if, for instance, you are maybe not the person who can have that conversation, having somebody else who is supportive of the family, being able to have that conversation, somebody who might have, oh, I don't know, attorney-client privilege potentially. And would be able to have those honest conversations with the family without risking the mandatory reporting.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. Otherwise, I have one, but I'm happy to finish this off with. Okay, so we've talked a lot about folks that work with disabled folks and medical providers and healthcare providers, but what as we, as community members, as community networks, as grassroots organizers, what role can we play in supporting disabled parents and parents of color who are navigating these systemic barriers, and how can we be co-conspirators with them to ensure that they are receiving full reproductive justice?
So I think as Robin pointed out, community networks are really essential. Community networks provide trust, understanding, and support that formal systems regularly fail to deliver. So when I'm thinking about serving multiply marginalized, disabled people who are parents or want to be parents, I'm thinking about grassroots organizations that are led by disabled people, understanding what it means to have to navigate these systems, and they understand what words you can and cannot say in order to keep your children in your care. So at my organization, Disability Empowerment Network, we've seen just how transformative it can be when disabled people support each other through parenting journeys, legal battles, hospital stays. And it can be just as easy as having someone in the room with you. I wish that I had a Jessica in the room when they were saying, like, sign this IUD paperwork. Like, I didn't have that. I just had me begging, like, I need to have my C-section now. So just showing up, being a presence can be enough, but listening, learning, fund our work, that's really important. Sharing stories and challenging all of the systems that is particularly that you are a part of. But most importantly, I would say, is respect the leadership of the disabled people.
I would sort of agree. I agree 100% with what Stephanie said. But I mean, I think this is sort of a thing I think about a lot. Sort of what is the role of lawyers, for example, and others in supporting disability justice? And I think that it goes to sort of everything Stephanie said, and really letting us be the leaders in it, right? And saying sort of, I have this skill, or I have this expertise, I have this training. How can I help further your mission? How can I be there to support, empower, educate, whatever it may be, parents with disabilities, those that want to become parents, and just disabled people exploring their entire reproductive journey, whatever that may be. How can we best help sort of further your goals? And so we are really the disabled people being sort of the drivers of it, and sort of then relying or gaining sort of the support from others as needed. And so I think, again, it's sort of recognizing that disabled people are the experts on this, and we are the ones that know sort of what we need. And so I think that to the extent that folks can really sort of center us, and then of course, as Stephanie said, and funding, really sort of funding this type of work, I think is so important. There is so limited funding, and I think that that will only worsen. So the extent to which you can really fund groups that do this work is important.
Thank you. So we are actually all done for today, but I am so incredibly grateful for everyone who has joined us. Thank you for joining us for Radical Inclusion at the DisCo. Today's conference has been recorded, and we are going to try and make that available to attendees and panelists, anybody who's interested after today. And please keep an eye out for an upcoming series of trainings from RRLI meant to put the learnings from today into practice. So we are planning on offering assistant style trainings, technical assistant style trainings to help healthcare providers, abortion support workers, and advocates to ensure that their work is accessible to disabled communities and to help destigmatize disabled sex and reproduction. Thank you again for all of our panelists who came today and participated, whether they were remote or were able to show up in person. We literally could not have done this without you, without your willingness to share your experiences and your expertise and travel, even when we know that it's really hard for disabled folks to travel. I really appreciate y'all trusting us with that. And thank you, of course, to Case Western Reserve University and the School of Law for supporting this important event, and the entire team of RRLI, because it took every single one of us working really hard over the last few months to pull this together. Thank you so much. If you're seeking CLE credit for today, Katie has forms and that you can go and fill out to get your CLE credit, because we all need, well, all of us lawyers need continuing legal education credit. If you have any questions, we'll be around for a little bit, and I appreciate you all joining us. Thank you so much.